Hey guys, I'm going to continue through the war. Hopefully you guys watched some of that Saving Private Ryan and maybe even President Reagan's speech. But we still got quite a bit to do here with the war, so I want to keep going. We're going to finish the war in Europe today, and then we'll move on to the Pacific, and I'll probably do 2 lectures on that, and then we'll pretty much be done with the war. I am going to attach some more videos and so forth that are pretty good, and actually I have another presentation I want to do on propaganda, dealing with American propaganda and Japanese propaganda during the war, which is pretty good. As I was talking about yesterday, guys, moving out across the hedgerows of France. A lot of these guys that landed on the beaches of Normandy, not just, the first waves, but, the guys that came in after. Basically, these guys are going to be walking across France. Did some catch rides on tanks, on trucks, and so forth, but they're going to walk their way across. Now, the Germans are going to fight in France, but eventually we're going to drive them out, as I'll get to it here today. Okay? So moving on to this slide, as I mentioned yesterday's lecture that Patton's going to get the Third Army, the U.S. Third Army, and he's going to strike out. So if you look at the Battle of Normandy, it lasts until July 24. Remember, June 6. So this is about 6 weeks of fighting just to clear Normandy. Okay. By that time, we had landed more than 1 million troops and controlled 1,500 square miles. Okay. Now, once we break out across France, you see here, this really takes place on July 25th. They start breaking out. Well, it's a month later that we will take Paris. Okay. And this is one of the most famous photographs of World War II, is the American troops marching down the Champs-Élysées. In the background there, you can see the Arc de Triomphe. Okay, and just guys, this is kind of racy a little bit, but there was a journalist named Ernie Pyle, and he wrote a couple books on World War II, and he traveled with our troops in a lot of Europe. Eventually, he had seen too much of the war and had to go home. I think he was really impacted when he came upon a situation where some of our troops had been hit by friendly fire, meaning that our artillery had rained down on our troops, and it was, obviously that's a horrible situation, friendly fire, and I think after that, Ernie Pyle said he had had enough and he came home. But when he talked about the liberation of Paris, he said, it was a grand celebration. The wine was flowing. Don't take this the wrong way, but he was kidding around. He said, if you were in Paris when we liberated Paris and you were a U.S. GI, if you didn't get laid, something was wrong with you. Okay, so it was a really exuberant time. At the time, the French were very grateful for getting rid of the Nazis for them. So that was pretty good. Okay, within 6 weeks of that, all of France is cleared of Germans. Okay, Germany will lose 500,000 men in France, and massive amounts of machinery. Okay, so by then we've got 3 million troops by September ready to go into Germany. Okay, so now the Germans, you remember the Maginot Line that the French had. Well, the Germans have their own defensive line called the Siegfried Line. Okay, and you can see here, these are dragon's teeth. You can't drive a tank, you can't drive a truck, you can't pull artillery through here because of dragon's teeth. You see them over here as well. This is a large gate that they had at the border. You have to move these massive I-beams, to get through there. The Germans are going to have fortifications. Now, when we go to the Eastern Front, we remember Germany went out into Russia. We talked about Stalingrad and Moscow, and eventually, the Russians start beating the Germans back. Okay, and they're actually ahead of us in that. Okay, so really we're seeing both sides collapse around the Germans. We're also fighting in Italy coming up from the south, which is, you know, bloody as well. So the Russians took back Romania and Belgrade. The Germans had dug in at Budapest, which of course is in Hungary. But as the Russians start moving through Poland, liberating Poland from the Nazis, the Germans are in deep trouble. Okay, so moving forward, guys, we got to go back across the pond because it's time for another election. Now, there may only be a few words on this slide, guys, but it's a very important slide, okay? Because this is Roosevelt's fourth election, right? So he won 32, 36, 40. Okay, let's just review. 32, he defeated Hoover. 36, he defeated Alf Landon of Kansas. Then Wendell Willkie in 1940. Okay, and then he's going to be running against Thomas Dewey here. Okay, here's Thomas Dewey. They made fun of Dewey, poor Dewey. Said he looked like the groomsman on a wedding cake, you know, those little figurines. Okay, and then also sometimes thought he looked like the little Monopoly guy, you know, the character from Monopoly. All right. This is the Electoral College vote here. You can see Roosevelt wins a landslide electorally, popular vote-wise, 25 million to 22 million. You see Kansas went to the Republicans, kind of the Great Plains out here. So it's kind of interesting there. But what's more important here, guys, is that Roosevelt's vice president, his choice changes. Okay, so his first VP was John Garner from Texas, right? And then you get Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace was his Secretary of Agriculture to begin, then became his vice president for 2 terms. Well, guys, if you do a little reading on Henry Wallace, it's pretty well known that he's basically a communist. He's a closet communist. And the Democratic Party basically told Roosevelt that they, you know, look at Roosevelt. Okay, this is the date of inauguration, guys. This is January 20th, 1945. Okay, Roosevelt will be dead within about 4 months. Okay, so Democrats know he's not healthy. So the VP choice is very important here. But it's interesting who he chose, choosing Harry Truman to be his vice president. Harry Truman, I mean, he's a World War I vet. He's from Missouri, Independence, Missouri. But he's kind of a political lightweight. He's not somebody that's got a lot of gravitas, if you will. So it's a really interesting pick. They had only met a couple of times. Okay, so as you can imagine, for this kind of newcomer to Washington, hang on, I gotta get rid of this cat. So choosing Truman is obviously, guys, going to pay. I mean, it's going to change history because I mean, the war's not over by the time Truman takes over, and he's going to make some really tough decisions at the end of the war. Who knows what would have happened if it was somebody else? You know what I mean? So we can only look back and look at Truman and judge him based on his decisions and the position he was put in. I happen to be a big fan of Harry Truman. Yes, I'm talking about the Democrat Harry Truman. But we'll talk a lot more about him in the coming days. Just a little bit of presidential trivia. Okay, as you can see here, Harry S. Truman. S does not have a period because that is his middle name. I read a biography on him a while back, and both parents had a middle name that they wanted to name after a family member. And both of those names started with S, and then rather than argue about it and get into a fight, they just chose S. That's his middle name, okay? Also pictured here with Roosevelt Truman. This is a guy named John Foster Dulles. Okay, he's guy that's going to be important both in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations here. Okay, later on. Okay, he's a heavyweight. He's a CIA director. His brother's going to become the Secretary of State, and so yeah, that's a heavyweight right there. Okay, so all right, so. Roosevelt gets reelected in 44. Okay, now that's November, right? So in December in Europe, we are going to get to the largest battle in the war for the United States. Okay, and this is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, so I'm going to put up a map here to kind of explain this, and then I'll come back to this slide. Okay. All right, so if you look here, this is Belgium, okay? You have Germany here, Luxembourg down here, and so this is all France, okay, right in here. And so basically American troops are along this line here, okay? There are some British troops here as well. Well, Hitler's going to make one last desperate bid, and his goal here is this is going to be a 60,000 vehicle, like mechanical invasion. He's using tanks and trucks and artillery, and they're going to try and at a very small point in our defenses or in our lines. Okay, they are going to try and break through. Okay, and then circle around here and capture as many Americans, circle around here, capture as many Americans as possible. And if he can capture a bunch of Americans, maybe Hitler can sue for peace. Okay? He's got enough of an army to make one last desperate bid. Now, he could have chosen to do that on the Eastern Front, okay, against the Russians, but he chose the Western Front because, guys, of those 3 million troops that we now have in country in France, a lot of them haven't seen combat. Okay, so they're green. And so this is going to be quite successful at the beginning, okay, but it's going to go south for the Germans eventually here, okay? One of the things you have to keep in mind, guys, it is December 16th of 1944. It's winter. It's really cold, okay? And shortly after the invasion, guys, it's going to start snowing. And it's going to keep snowing, okay? Now, this does benefit the Germans to a point because with the cloud cover of the snow and so forth, we have air superiority over the Germans at this point. We control the skies, but you can't use your air power if you can't see the ground. Okay, so because of the weather, it's going to help the Germans. Okay, eventually, it's going to hurt everybody. The weather. Okay, so the Germans got off to a good start. Now, this is taking place in heavily wooded areas, okay? This is the Ardennes forest that we talked about before, that pocket of forest. It's dense, okay? And then you've got the winter. So I've got some pictures here. You can see the trees and the snow and so forth. And guys, I'm going to attach some video here. And if you watch it, you're going to be introduced to a guy named Rocky Blount. Okay, he's from Massachusetts. He's a drummer, and he's in the Battle of the Bulge. And they kind of follow his story, and it kind of shows you what this was like. Okay, so they drove 60-mile bulge into our lines, and that's where we get the name of the battle. Okay, now Patton and Third Army and Monty and his British Eighth Army are going to help pinch off this bulge, as I'll show you on the map in a minute. I'm going to talk about General McAuliffe, okay, and his heroic stand at Bastion, okay, and I'll talk about what this means, okay. So let me come back over here to the map. This is actually, a really great story, okay. as American lines retreated, as you can see here, okay, Bastogne is a town that's very important. See all these roads coming in and out of Bastogne? Okay, it's an important town. And so the 101st Airborne, these are the same guys that parachuted in behind enemy lines on D-Day, okay? 101st Airborne, and then you have part of the 10th Army, that's the Mountain Division, okay? So these are tough guys, okay? So they're completely surrounded by the Germans, all right? General McAuliffe is in charge. And as you can see, points of attack here, they're going to hold off the Germans. Now, this is, stop. This is part of a military strategy called mass of force, okay? So when the Germans attacked here, McAuliffe used massive force, put everything he had into that point of German attack, giving the illusion that we had more troops at Bastogne than we really had. Because if the Germans knew how few we had there, they would have just kept coming and overrun us. But because of his strategy and his tactics of McAuliffe, so when they attack around the rear, McAuliffe does massive force to that point of attack. And we're going to hold off the Germans. Germans become frustrated. And so they send a letter to General McAuliffe. And the letter says, we have you completely surrounded. You need to surrender. And McAuliffe gets this letter from a courier. And he looks at it. And his first response is, nuts. Nuts. We're surrounded, right? But then he's talking to his other officers. And he says, we're not going to surrender. What do you think our response should be? And one of the guys says, well, why don't you just say first thing you said, nuts. And so on that letter, he replied nuts and gave it back to the Germans. Okay. They're like, what does that mean? Okay. So they attack again and we hold them off. Okay. Because of the cloud cover, we couldn't drop supplies in to help these guys, more ammunition, food, water, that kind of stuff. So they're kind of on their own. Eventually, after about 2 weeks, the clouds finally part. We're able to drop in supplies, okay? Now, Hodges and the U.S. First Army is up here, as is Montgomery's up here as well. He's going to drive down through here. And then Patton, who is a little bit further to the south down here, he's going to put his Third Army on a forced march of 48 hours to go north, okay? And Patton's army is going to come up through here, and they're going to cut off this bulge and capture or kill most of these Germans that are here, okay? And at this point, guys, the Germans are pretty much done, okay? Now, this is a devastating battle, guys. I talked about the German 88 millimeter shells, okay? So these big shells are going off in the treetops, sending out shards of wood, shrapnel. It's awful, guys. The United States lost 19,000 men here, okay? And I don't have this on here, but they actually have 82, I think it's 80, maybe it's 81,000 American casualties, okay? So this is the biggest battle. We're talking there's 500,000 Americans, 55,000 British, 600,000 Germans. Okay, this is 1.1 million men fighting in this battle. Now, I'm not doing it justice. There's a lot more I could talk about with this, like the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, which is part of the Ardennes, which is very thick, dense forest, where we tried to go through that and attack the Germans. It was a bloodbath. We could have just gone around it, but we chose not to. That was a really bad decision. There's another part of this called the Malmedy Massacre, which is the worst atrocity against the Americans by the Germans during the war, where they captured some Americans during the Battle of the Bulge, and instead of making them prisoners of war, they just started killing them. And I think something like 80 Americans were assassinated in the massacre. A few did escape, and they were able to tell the story of what happened there. So guys, yeah, there's a whole lot in here. I just can't get into too much of it. The Germans lost 120,000 of their best men, okay, and they're in real trouble now. So, hey, make sure you check out that video I post along with this today, okay? It's really good, okay, and it's a little bit heart wrenching, but they interview Rocky Blunt. He's pretty good, okay. I put this slide together. It's just kind of a fun slide, talking about Patton. Considered one of the greatest generals of World War II for the United States. His reckless, outspoken manner gained him friends and enemies of equal determination. During the war, he led troops in Morocco, Tunisia, and Sicily. Okay, that's when, after Italy, he had his army taken away from him for striking that soldier. Then took command of the Third Army, leading troops through German lines at Normandy to traverse France. His toughness on his enemies as well as his own forces earned him the nickname Old Blood and Guts. Okay, that's a good nickname right there. Okay, this is his pistol that he was famous for carrying. This is actually a shiny helmet. He has a couple different helmets. One that's like silver, like metallic, that he wears. And obviously you can see he's got 3 stars on his shoulder right there. Okay, he's hard to work with. He causes problems. Actually, he got 4 stars on his collar right there. So, he's he's a legend. Okay, and I'll try and connect that speech from the movie Patton as well. I talked about that yesterday. But anyhow, yeah. Question, do we win this war without Patton? That's kind of a good question. All right. Next slide here. This is just showing what it was like in the Battle of the Bulge, and I'll attach some video for that. Okay. The next thing we're going to be talking about, guys, and I'll hold off to tomorrow on this, or I won't do. I'll be back Tuesday because we're going to take a 4-day weekend for Easter, guys. Right? We've got these 3 meeting, and this will happen shortly before Roosevelt's death, and I got some cool stuff to talk about. This is a hugely important meeting that's going to affect Europe for the next 40 years. Okay, so I'll come back to that on Tuesday. All right, so hey, I hope you're enjoying these, guys. Give me a thumbs up if you did. A few of you did yesterday. Thank you for that. Just some type of interaction. I can't tell whether you're watching these or not. I hope you are. I hope you're enjoying them, and I hope you're well. We'll see you after the weekend. Happy Easter.